from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
The U.S. and China agree to meet again. Welcome to the Tuesday edition as the Treasury Secretary and U.S. Trade Rep wrap a meeting with their Chinese counterparts in Stockholm. With news today, a redhead on the terminal of a tariff extension, at least an agreement in principle. President Trump still needs to sign off on it. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Kailey, we're waiting for the players here, Bessent and Greer, to emerge in a news conference that could begin at any moment.
Yeah, you wonder what the purpose of the news conference is when they've already shared a lot with reporters in the hallways. As they say, it is President Trump that ultimately is going to have to make a decision as to just how long this trade truce between the world's two largest economies will be extended, knowing that the current truce is set to expire on August 12th. And according to the Treasury Secretary, they're going to continue discussing the terms here. It does not seem yet that anything is necessarily final after 2 days of talks in Stockholm.
Clearly a very fluid situation here, and surprised to see the headline that they did not discuss a Trump-Xi meeting in their session today, which went on for several hours. To that end, there are reporters in a conference room in Stockholm that have been waiting for many more hours to hear this briefing, and I'm sure are packed with questions. We're going to bring you this conversation live, assuming that it begins while we're still on the air here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
And of course, we expect a lot of that to center around questions around magnet exports from China. Of course, that is one of the primary things the U.S. wants, is those rare earths to get to the U.S. Manufacturers of various goods, from fighter jets to semiconductors and electric cars. They want access to that. That has been a sticking point, we understand, over the course of what has now been 3 rounds of negotiations with, as you say, Joe, more talks set to continue. But at least talking is better than not talking, perhaps?
Well, that's true. Look, it's being seen as a win to at least continue this conversation. Wall Street seems pretty underwhelmed by all of this. Kailey, I guess this idea of an extension was baked in. They'd like to see a little more detail.
Well, you mentioned Wall Street. You know who checks that for us? Charlie Pellet up in New York. So let's check in with him now. Hey, Charlie.
Well, hello there. We're all over the numbers. Let's get right to the story. Before we get to the numbers, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says the U.S. and China will continue discussing the terms of a tariff truce extension. President Trump will make the final call. We'll have the latest for you coming up right here on Balance of Power. But here's where we stand in terms of equity market response. S&P right now down 7, 63.82 where we stand. A drop right now of 0.1%. Dow Industrials down 140 points on the Dow. A decline right now of 0.3%. Nasdaq down 19, drop there of 0.1%. The Nasdaq 100 index in the green now, up by about 0.1%. Our Mag 7 index does remain lower by 0.3%. 4 out of the 7 of those Mag 7 names will be reporting in the next couple of days. Apple and Amazon on Thursday. Microsoft and Meta Platforms report tomorrow. 10-year at 4.32%. The 2-year 3.87%. Gold is up $9 the ounce. Spot gold up 0.3%, 33.24. West Texas Intermediate crude rallying 1.5%, 67.69. And Bitcoin now with a $117,000 handle, 117,639 on a Bitcoin. Union Pacific is acquiring Norfolk Southern in a cash and stock transaction valued at about $85 billion. Shares of both railroads, however, are trading lower. Union Pacific down right now by 3.5%. Norfolk Southern down by 3.2%. Again, recapping right now, S&P narrowing its loss to just under 0.1%. Balance of Power continues right now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Taking a look at the market reaction, which maybe isn't much of a reaction at all to the news we're getting out of Stockholm from the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer as they wrap 2 days of talks with their Chinese counterparts. China, of course, emerging from that meeting, saying an understanding was reached to extend the tariff truce between the two countries, while the U.S. side is still saying at this time, Joe, nothing is final until President Trump signs off on it. It's unclear what kind of extension we could be looking at, though adding another 90 days is an option.
So we figure Scott Bessent's on the phone with the boss on Air Force One right now. They have to obviously bring the terms or some of the framework terms that they've agreed to here to the president. Scott Bessent saying earlier off camera, Kailey, that there are still some remaining issues, but called them small and coming from the Chinese delegation. Strange they didn't talk about a meeting between the two principals. That was one thing we thought we might get some news on.
Yeah, apparently no such meeting between President Trump and China's Xi Jinping was necessarily discussed. That's after, of course, President Trump pushed back on reports of this idea that he himself is pushing for a summit. I guess we'll have to stay tuned on that one as we still stay tuned to see when this news conference with these two individuals in Stockholm is actually going to begin.
Took the Truth Social this morning to make clear he wasn't asking for an invitation. Laura Davison is with us. She's just jumped out of the newsroom to help us as we wait to hear from Bessent and Greer, of course, our deputy Washington bureau chief here in the nation's capital. Great to see you, Laura. What are you going to be listening for, and when do we expect to hear from them?
One, has Trump signed off on this? You know, this little break we're having, this could be a time for Bessent to go to Trump and try to get some clarity here so they can come out with a more definitive announcement. But also, what are those issues that are still sticking? You know, Greer and Bessent, when they spoke just moments ago, mentioned that magnets are still continuing to be a problem. They also mentioned that they didn't speak about some other things, you know, including like export controls are going to keep on a separate track. TikTok apparently also did not come up. But what is clear is that this may continue to be one of these every 90 days, we get another 90-day extension sort of thing, not unlike the TikTok deal. Just as, you know, as Trump has mentioned, doing trade deals is hard, and especially with China, it's going to be particularly thorny.
Well, and are export controls really separate to this conversation? If we're saying our issue is magnets, that's about China controlling the exports of those and China wanting us to loosen up on our export restrictions around critical technology. How are these not intertwined?
This is really kind of the trap that Trump has essentially set for himself. If he's made everything about trade and used tariffs as the leverage against any problem, whether it be you know, on AI and chips, whether it be about fentanyl. And so then trying to disentangle some of these issues becomes very, very difficult because some of the, you know, the problems that the Chinese have on certain issues are very much intertwined with something that Bessent and Greer say they don't want to talk about.
It's interesting to think that we're compartmentalizing on a level like this when there's clearly so much interplay between the issues that you just mentioned. The White House is going to try to frame this as a win. We've been talking a bit about the rollout here and the sort of lack of choreography. First, we get headlines from the Chinese side. They've got reporters waiting in Stockholm for hours now for a briefing. They end up doing, I guess, a hallway gaggle. Maybe you can tell us with print reporters, and they have yet to emerge to give their side of the story. What's going on with this?
It's unclear. So people should not read too much into the choreography at this moment. But what is clear is that they are not on the same page on messaging, and that you have each side sort of jockeying to get in front of reporters, get in front of cameras before the other side to try to frame the discussion. We've seen this, you know, with other trade announcements where, you know, the U.S. has come out and announced something is true, catching the other side by surprise. This is not unlike, you know, some situations we've seen in the past.
Do we have any reason to expect, Laura, that President Trump would not want to sign off on an extension of this truce? He doesn't want to see tariffs rebound to the extraordinarily high levels that the U.S. and China had placed on each other months ago, does he?
He has very little reason to push back against an extension. The question is, does he want to do that today, or does he want to wait? There's still about 2 weeks left until that August 12th deadline. If he, you know, he comes and hears the terms from Bessent and Greer and decides that's not enough, he may tell them to go back and say, hey, push for a little bit more. We still have time before that August 12th deadline. And remember, everyone else is right now currently focused on August 1st, this week,
Friday.
All of the other tariff deadlines coming up.
It's a great point that we are reminded of this. If you're just joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio, we welcome you to Balance of Power. We've been waiting for some time now for a news conference with the Treasury Secretary and the U.S. Trade Representative following their third session now with their Chinese counterparts, talking trade in Stockholm. The president is on Air Force One, as we've mentioned, so maybe we're waiting for him to have a conversation with reporters beyond the secretaries. It could take some time. They're on no particular schedule here in Stockholm. But if we cast about another 90 days or so, that's not too far away from the summit in November that was suggested could be a venue for Trump and Xi to meet. Isn't it possible they're talking about this along the side and just didn't make any news on it today?
It's very well could be. You know, we saw Trump kind of push back on this potential summit, saying that, you know, he would go if invited, but hasn't been invited, but maybe he has been invited. You know, Trump wants to get in the room with some of these foreign leaders. We've seen this, you know, really from day one, you know, as in his second term. But I think it's clear that at the point of they are at these talks right now, they're just trying to agree on an extension. They're not necessarily at the point of even coming to some sort of bigger, more comprehensive framework.
Yeah, nothing is done until it's done. And that doesn't just apply to reaching some kind of an agreement or extension with China. But as you were alluding to, the Friday deadline, our understanding is Europe is currently racing to get something down on paper to kind of formalize the terms that Ursula von der Leyen and Donald Trump agreed to on a handshake over this weekend. And the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, in an interview on another network, suggested there's still a lot that needs to be ironed out, even for the deals that they're ready to announce, that they did so eagerly. It's not really all clear that this is finalized.
It is not at all clear this is finalized. In fact, I think we can say it is not finalized and that we have no paper. We saw this in the Vietnam deal. We saw this with the Japanese deal, that these things sort of, there's an announcement and then, maybe there's some disagreement on what the actual announcement was before they actually get these things on paper. That's the thing that could really start to spook markets as we get towards this August 1 deadline of just, people, you have two very different interpretations. And when there's nothing written down, and particularly nothing in a legal language, interpretations can run wild and every side can see what they want to see.
All right. Laura Davison, our Deputy Washington Bureau Chief, thank you so much for joining us as we still are watching Stockholm here to see when the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and USTR Jamieson Greer will emerge. They are expected to partake in a press conference with reporters who, as Joe's mentioned, have been waiting in that room for hours on end for them to arrive. We'll, of course, bring it to you live on Bloomberg TV and radio when it does begin. But in the meantime, we want to add the voice now of Anna Ashton. She's founder of Ashton Analytics, a China expert and a U.S.-China trade expert at that. She's a former China analyst with the Department of Defense. Welcome back to Balance of Power, Anna. It's good to have you. As we understand, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has described small issues remaining with China, mainly having to do with the Chinese delegation. Do you have a sense of what the problem here may be?
I think, Kailey, that the devil is in the details is sort of a theme that's emerging from this series of meetings. Each time we've had rather vague readouts. I think what Laura pointed out just now about the fact that there's a window here to sort of iron out differences from now until August 12th. That's important because we saw differences get ironed out seemingly after the July meeting in London, too. There was, confirmation of what the outcomes were a little while later. And I expect that maybe that's what we'll see here as well.
Well, let's talk about the devil today, because you could describe export controls as the devil. You could describe Russia as the devil, maybe rare earths. Aren't these all supposed to be part of a trade deal? And it looks like in many cases they didn't talk about any of them, including a meeting between Trump and Xi.
Right. I mean, supposedly they didn't talk about any of them. I find it very difficult to believe that export controls didn't come up because, quite recently, Commerce Secretary Lutnick was talking about how there was going to be a continuation of this framework that was established in Geneva and London that included a balanced rollback, quote unquote, with assurances from the Chinese side that licenses would be approved expeditiously for exports of rare earths and magnets in exchange for lifting of various export controls on the U.S. side. I don't see how they separate that from trade, having had several different cabinet members confirm more than once that these things are part of the negotiations.
Well, and because they're part of the negotiations and because China has such a chokehold on this market in particular, does that mean that when they're all at the table, it's actually China that has the upper hand here, Anna?
Absolutely. I think that it's pretty clear that China does have the upper hand for now. And what would remove that advantage from Beijing? Nothing I can think of in the short term. We can't catch up on, supplying ourselves with sufficient heavy and light rare earths or magnets anytime in the near future. And it sort of doesn't matter what kinds of incentives or policies are thrown at that. It's just not a short-term problem. Therefore, China is going to continue to hold this dominant position for a while, and that is significant leverage. I have to assume that is why Russia and Iran, compliance with Russia and Iran sanctions was suddenly part of the talking points on the U.S. side, because, it contradicts some of the things that the president said after the bombing of the nuclear sites in Iran. He was pretty clear that he was encouraging China to continue doing business with Iran. But maybe that was, seeking leverage ahead of this round of talks.
Well, it's interesting that there's no agreement on export controls today, as we've discussed, Anna. And would that suggest to you that it is really the one point of leverage that the U.S. does have at this table?
It's an important point of leverage, but only in the sense that, the Trump administration has given Beijing a reason to believe, Joe, that perhaps the export controls that were not negotiable under the Biden administration are negotiable now. They've already kind of ceded ground when it comes to the export controls that they implemented, that the Trump administration itself implemented this spring. Those they already agreed to lift in exchange for facilitation of rare earth and magnet exports when they met in London. At least that's how they've described it. So now we're talking about export controls that were applied during the Biden administration. Either there's flexibility or there's not. That's going to be a huge sticking point for China. And maybe on the U.S. side, the sticking point is that if they're going to be flexible on that stuff, they need China to be willing to approve licenses for exports of things that could have dual uses to entities that could be part of the military-industrial complex. I have a hard time believing that China will agree to that, though.
As we try to get a sense of what was discussed in a third round of negotiations between the U.S. and China in Stockholm. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kailey Leinz here as well in Washington, D.C. There's much we don't know here, Kailey, and what we do know still needs a sign-off from the President of the United States.
Yeah, the Treasury Secretary going as far as to say he knows that China came out of the meeting saying that there had been an agreement to extend the trade truce beyond August 12th. He said, we have not agreed. Nothing is agreed until we speak with President Trump. Yeah. But we also learned simultaneously, as President Trump right now is gaggling with reporters aboard Air Force One, that he has spoken to Scott Bessent, who will brief him again in the Oval Office tomorrow. And at that time, he says he will either approve it or not when it comes to an extension with China. No talk about a summit, at least apparently at the table here. We know the two countries, our two governments, have been discussing this idea. A potential venue in November has been floated, but there's no news on a meeting between President Trump and President Xi. And most believe there could be no real trade deal without that happening. Yeah, it's also interesting to consider whether or not a trade deal can happen without it also factoring in export controls. Yes, the U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer said that conversation apparently in Stockholm was really one-sided, that yes, they talked about export controls, but only China's controls of rare earth minerals, not necessarily the export controls the U.S. has put into place on critical technologies. That was pretty newsy. We were discussing this with Anna Ashton beforehand, knowing that NVIDIA today put in an order for 300,000 of its H20 chips that have just recently been cleared to sell once again in China. But for that to not come up in this session is confounding. Wall Street's been watching all of this, by the way. Shares of NVIDIA, which have been knocking on an all-time high, barely moved during this whole conversation today. Well, let's see what's happening on Wall Street beyond NVIDIA as they digest all of these headlines emerging from Stockholm and turn to Charlie Pellet up in New York for a look. Hey, Charlie. Hi, thank you very much, Kailey and Joe. Right now we are looking at a lower U.S. stock market. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ do remain very much in the red, down 12 points on the S&P, retreating from an earlier record. Right now down 0.2%, 63.76 where we stand on the S&P. The Dow down 184 right now. That is a drop of 0.4%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index down 38, drop there of 0.2%. NASDAQ 100 Index, a little change, down less than 0.1%. Our Mag 7 Index down 0.4%. 4 out of the 7 of the Mag 7 names will be reporting this week. Apple and Amazon on Thursday, Microsoft, Meta Platforms tomorrow. All 4 of those names are trading lower. 10-year at 4.33% ahead of the Fed decision tomorrow. We've got the 2-year 3.87%. Gold, meanwhile, up $12 the ounce, up 0.4%. West Texas Intermediate crude now up 2.5% at $68.39 a barrel, and Bitcoin down 0.2%, 117,850 on Bitcoin. One additional headline to pass along: President Trump giving Russia 10 days to reach an agreement with Ukraine. The president says in 10 days the U.S. will be putting tariffs on Russia. Again, recapping, S&P down 0.2%. Balance of Power continues right now. We got you covered on trade. Back we go to Washington, and once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz. All right, Charlie Pellet, many thanks. We'll get back to Charlie again closer to the top of the hour here for the latest
on markets, which have been listening very closely to the conversation in Stockholm. That's where Scott Bessent and Jamieson Greer, the Treasury Secretary and U.S. Trade Representative, have just finished briefing reporters who waited hours for a readout on their negotiating session with the Chinese. And we want to bring you into that conference room in Stockholm right now. Bloomberg Europe correspondent Oliver Crook was there for the back and forth with Bessent and Greer and joins us now with a live update. Give us a sense of the mood in that room, Oliver. We appreciate your reporting today. It took them a long time to come out, and while Scott Bessent tried to frame this as a productive meeting, there are questions about some of the sticking points that remain.
Absolutely. I think you've got a correct read on the situation after 2 days of discussions that we've had between the Vice Premier of China, Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Ambassador Greer on the trade side, trying to hammer out the details to get what we were sort of hoping was a rubber stamp 90-day extension to those trade tariffs that have been put on hold with China that are slated to come back into effect on August the 12th. Very, very high rates of tariff if they do not have an agreement. They were not able to conclude that conversation and come to an agreement in the meetings over the last 2 days. They did make a lot of positive signals about how conversations were going, that they were very productive, that they are now going to go back to Washington, D.C. to consult with the president. And it sounds like this is really going to come down to the president of the United States, whether or not he approves this extension. We do know that the most likely outcome, if there is an extension, is another 90-day extension. A lot of positive noises. Again, there was no mention of a possible summit between Trump and Xi Jinping. It seems that we are pretty far from that in terms of where we are on negotiations. That is not something that appears imminent. And we also heard from Jamieson Greer saying that they never want to talk about magnets again. As far as they're concerned, that issue is settled with the Chinese, and they'd like to see those continue to flow. That has been agreed. But I do think that one of the sort of salient points here, and one of the most important points, was really the reiterating by the U.S. Treasury Secretary about this issue of Russian oil and secondary sanctions, something that it sounds like we just heard again from the President of the United States, that if there is not meaningful efforts from Vladimir Putin to come to a ceasefire in Ukraine, that you could see those secondary sanctions implemented on Russia. That could be anywhere from 100% tariffs on anybody who's buying crude oil from Russia to 500% tariffs on anybody who's buying fossil fuels from Russia. And obviously, China is a very large consumer there. And he was saying that the Chinese, they talked about this, that the Chinese are very sort of concerned with their own sovereignty, and it's up to them if they want to pay 100% tariffs on Russian oil.
Yep, 10 days from now, according to President Trump. Bloomberg's Oliver Crook reporting live for us from Stockholm. Thank you so much. Of course, the latest on the outcome of talks between the U.S. and China, an outcome I think it's fair to say remains uncertain. So on that note, we go back now to Anna Ashton of Ashton Analytics, a China expert who joined us earlier on Bloomberg TV and radio. Anna, now that we've heard from Bessent and Greer about what was and was not discussed today, would you describe this third round of talks as significant forward progress, or is this just stasis?
Gosh, Kailey, I think my biggest takeaway was that it seems like the U.S. is trying to kind of flip the script. We talked before the press conference about whether or not China had a decisive upper hand because of its monopoly on rare earths and magnets. And I said, yeah, I think they do, because there's more room for them to hold the line and also offer compromises than there is given the political pressures for the U.S. to hold the line or offer compromises on export controls. I think they're trying to make it not about export controls. They're trying to make this a balanced rollback, as Lutnick said, of tariffs in exchange for a continued or increased flow of rare earths and magnets. And then they're also throwing in the threat of secondary sanctions. It seems like that seems like a sound play on the part of the Trump administration in terms of trying to find effective leverage. I think that is effective leverage, given the fact that the level of tariffs that could be imposed in a snapback would be really, really high and certainly would do damage to a Chinese economy that is already kind of, struggling to gain momentum. I thought it was interesting how much Bessent emphasized the success so far of the tariff strategy. It's clear that the point they're trying to drive home is that they're not backing away from their tariff strategy, and tariffs will continue to loom as a threat if China is not sufficiently cooperative. And of course, 232 tariffs could be part of that.
Scott Bessent seemed a bit miffed that the Chinese told reporters they had an agreement to extend the deadline, reiterating that only Donald Trump could approve that, and the president has not made this clear. What did you think of the body language, the tone? Are these actors getting along or not?
I'm sure it was tense. And I think, the Chinese side has had its opportunities to be frustrated with the way that Bessent and other members of the Trump administration have characterized previous rounds of talk. And perhaps that's why Vice Commerce Minister Lee decided to go ahead and lean into his interpretation of the outcome of this round of talks. I could easily see them, caveating in reply to Bessent that they just meant an agreement in principle. Of course, they just meant an agreement in principle. They both have to go back to their respective leaders for approval of anything they agree to.
Mm-hmm. Really great to have you with us, Anna Ashton, Ashton Analytics, and many thanks for being so generous with your time, watching and listening to this conversation for us, so we can bring the best analysis to our viewers and listeners. Kailey, we want to mention another breaking story right now. As we've alluded to a couple of times, Donald Trump is briefing reporters on Air Force One, or at least was a short time ago, making news not only on trade, but also on geopolitics specific to Russia. Remembering yesterday, he said he might move up the deadline for Russia to reach peace in Ukraine, promising the secondary sanctions that we were just talking about. He's now given it 10 days. Donald Trump says Russia has 10 more days to reach a truce in Ukraine. It is moving oil prices right now. We've seen crude oil move back above $68 a barrel on this headline. And we want to bring in Mara Rudman for more on this, professor at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, former U.S. diplomat, back on Bloomberg TV and radio. Mara, your reaction following President Trump's visit to Scotland this weekend to this more intense rhetoric when it comes to Russia. He said that moving the deadline has not resulted in any progress yet. Will this headline make that different?
John, good to be back with you. I'm not sure that Donald Trump saying it or saying it louder or shortening the number of days is what's going to make the difference. I hope what Donald Trump is learning and seeing is that the United States is much stronger in whatever it says and whatever it moves to do when we have friends and allies with us who are like-minded in approach. And it's worth nurturing and building and spending time and attention with those relationships. And I hope some of what we're seeing from him is a result of that.
Well, but what will the results of that ultimately be, Mara? It's one thing for President Trump's attitude to change. It's entirely another for President Putin's. Do you expect that will happen?
Well, I think President Putin is constantly, not unlike President Trump, calculating where his interests lie and how to achieve them. And so the question of secondary sanctions, of how much pain, frankly, can be inflicted on the Russian economy and the extent to which there's the capacity to keep or limit China from helping or bailing out Russia in the way that they have. All of those things are going to factor into whether we ultimately see changes from Putin. I don't think he is suicidal. He wants to continue to rule, and he wants his country to remain allied with him. But it's not clear how quickly we will see turns because of how deeply entrenched his issues are in going into Ukraine and how rightfully entrenched the Ukrainians are in having the Russians depart and stop their offensive.
We've spent the bulk of our program today, Mara, talking about trade, whether it's with regard to China, the EU, or any other partner that is facing a deadline here coming up next month, whether it be the 1st or the 12th. And a lot of that talk has revolved around the idea of the taco trade, the fact that the markets are still near all-time highs despite the great uncertainty. And I wonder if there's an element of that here. Does Vladimir Putin actually believe that Donald Trump will go through with the threats that he's making?
Yeah, it's a fair question. And there's plenty of reason to see inconsistency in President Trump and his actions. And so both in terms of the economy and in terms of how other world leaders look at and assess the United States, it will be important for President Trump to be able to display and act with some degree of consistency and not, not pivot his positions by sometimes up to 180 degrees overnight. And again, we have too little in the mix now to know whether he's capable of doing that.
Well, as we consider President Trump's shifting positions, we saw a notable break yesterday between him and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on another issue, which is the situation with hunger in Gaza. Netanyahu obviously not characterizing it as starvation. President Trump says he begs to differ and thinks the images don't lie. But he also just said aboard Air Force One that he thinks Israel could do a good job with food centers in Gaza. How much do you expect the pressure on Netanyahu and Israel specifically to ramp up from President Trump?
Well, again, I think the question here is one of consistency, because while I appreciate the fact that he acknowledged the very real facts on the ground in terms of the human lives and the suffering that is occurring in Gaza, and was able to acknowledge that while Hamas has a role in that for sure, and brought all of this upon the people of Gaza, that Israel's actions are also culpable. He needs to be able to continue with that kind of approach and to present solution sets. And there are some within Israel who also want to see that, who have a different view than Prime Minister Netanyahu. Notable among those who would support some of the solution sets others are bringing forward the Israeli military, who frankly wanted the original system of food distribution and humanitarian aid to continue and were overruled by the political elements of Prime Minister Netanyahu and those around him.
All right, Mara Rudman, professor at the University of Virginia's Miller Center and former U.S. diplomat, joining us here on Balance of Power. Thank you so much. And President Trump just speaking again on Gaza aboard Air Force One to reporters, saying those kids are starving and that everyone thinks Gaza photos are horrible. But he also is commenting on the other news we're dealing with, of course, the U.S. and China wrapping a second day of meetings in Stockholm. President Trump saying that while we understand it wasn't discussed at the meeting, he does think that Chinese President Xi Jinping wants to meet, and that will probably happen before the end of the year, Joe.
Having taken to Truth Social earlier to make clear that he was not asking for an invitation, that the Chinese were in fact sending one. Whether that summit happens, we'll let you know as we wait to learn much more about the deal, the framework at least that was struck, and whether President Trump is going to sign off on all of this. Meet us back here at 5 p.m. Eastern Time for the late edition of Balance of Power to seek answers to these questions on Bloomberg.